Hi listeners, and welcome to the latest Footnote episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm still Alex Sargent.
And I'm about to be a very plasmatic Chris Holliday.
You've shot your gun already,
I know.
Chris. Yes, today we're doing plasmaticness. This is a term that has come up on the podcast a few times.
It comes up all the time.
You love it.
I do.
So that means you're going to have no problems telling me what it is in approximately 10 minutes.
Yep, sure.
So why don't we start with, where does it come from? Tell me about plasmaticness.
So plasmaticness probably stands, and this is the way I always communicate this to my students, as one of the first sort of formal appreciations of the animated medium. It's crucially a term that is not industry sanctioned, i.e. it's a term that exists in criticism. The industry term would loosely be rubberhosing, and we're talking about a style of animation. So rubberhosing as a style of animation, the first dominant style of North American animation. In terms of character, when we talk of rubberhosing, we mean characters with arms and legs and appendages that act as if they were rubber hoses. So the industry calls it rubberhosing. The audience, and specifically Eisenstein, so Sergei Eisenstein, Russian filmmaker, formalist, making films in the 20s, 30s and 40s.
Very poignantly known for directing Battleship Potemkin and that famous Odessa Steps sequence.
Yes. That has been homaged in many films, from The Untouchables to Ghostbusters, I think.
So Soviet experimental, it always comes up on silent film and history of film courses.
Yep.
Montage editing, all that kind of stuff.
Which makes actually the montage, his use, Eisenstein's use of montage, the famous sequence in Potemkin of the kind of stirring lions, is, you could argue, an example of animation. So it kind of makes perfect sense that Eisenstein would be interested in specifically Disney animation. So Disney animation of the 30s and 40s, as they've moved from a series of shorts, the Silly Symphonies shorts, to feature-length production. You have Eisenstein, who as a formalist, I guess, as I said, it makes perfect sense that he would eulogize over a particular kind of quality to animated cartoons, and specifically Disney animated cartoons, that he would call plasmaticness. So we've got rubberhosing as the industry term for this, and plasmaticness is a term that sort of happens in reception.
So let's just make sure everything is clear as crystal. We're talking about those cartoons that were around in the sort of 20s and 30s, Mickey Mouse cartoons.
Yes.
Steamboat Willie, those kind of things.
Yep.
The Silly Symphonies, they're now called, were called at the time.
Yeah.
And we're talking about bits in those cartoons where, like, characters will, inflate another character to the size of a balloon by sticking a gas canister in their mouths, or cut off their arm and they'll grow it back and turn it into a bow. They have a kind of elastic looseness to their physical form that was quite typical of cartoons during this period.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about Eisenstein's writing is that, well, first of all, it was unpublished at the time.
So that's the other thing I just wanted to clarify. So he's writing about these cartoons.
Yeah, he's writing in the 1940s, and he's writing in note form, often in abridged form. These notes are incomplete, and he's writing, as you say, about the Silly Symphonies, so a series of 75 cartoons made by Disney between 1929 and 1939. Disney made a lot of series of shorts, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, the Alice comedies, and the Silly Symphonies, probably the most famous, that were essentially testing grounds for a synchrony between sound and image. And the Silly Symphonies also played with Technicolor but Eisenstein's work is sort of important because it sort of sits at it. It's one of the things I like about plasmaticness is that it's kind of fourfold. It's a technological category, it's a historical category, it's a political category, and it's a aesthetic category. So it has these four components, really. So the aesthetic category is that Eisenstein is eulogizing over this sort of the irresistible changeability of Disney's animated characters, the way that they can suddenly reform. It's that sort of incredulity of fantasy to some extent. So the ways in which He says, what's strange is not that it exists, what's strange is that it attracts. So ink, paint, and paper have their own kind of vitality and impermanence. And so he's really interested at an aesthetic level of the sort of change, the mutability and the transformative potential of animated bodies. So it's a historical or it's a formal category describing a certain kind of aesthetic that was dominant across Disney's animated cartoons that would ultimately give way to a more hyper-realist way of seeing the world. So therefore it's also a historical category because it tells us about the difference between Disney animation of the 20s and 30s and early 40s and later feature-length films.
Right.
The sort of shedding of a plasmatic sensibility at the expense of a more dominant hyperrealism.
Okay, so we're talking like, before we get like Snow White and Bambi.
Eisenstein was not a fan of Bambi. He said it was too realistic.
Right, okay, so before we get those movies that now we go, ooh, aren't they cool, aren't they realistic? We have these movies that are, as you say, characters kind of with rubber bodies, rubber hose bodies that Eisenstein calls plasmatic.
Yep.
It's a historical category now because those films are of a period.
Yes.
But it's also a theoretical category.
No. So it's an aesthetic category because it tells us about a certain kind of metaphysical immobility.
Right. So what does it tell us about that?
So we have, on the one hand, it's an aesthetic category, it's a historical category. The political category is key. So one of the things that entrances Eisenstein about plasmaticness is this idea of it's a rejection. It's a rejection, he says, against the metaphysical immobility of the once and forever given. That's kind of like the famous quote.
And just to play devil's advocate, what does that mean?
Okay, so I suppose the best way of describing it is he's interested in exhilarating animated worlds that mark a break from the mechanized, standardized existence of a world of the 1930s, a modern world of the 1930s that he says was graphed, quote, by the cent and the dollar. So we have that kind of conveyor belt assembly line of production. We have a certain kind of modernist, mechanized, ritualistic way of seeing and living in the world that he argues plasmaticness sort of challenges or goes against or unlocks. It takes us back to a sort of pre-conscious mode of existence where everything is unfixed and doesn't yet have a state. And it's in that sort of, I guess, it's in that mocking of the body and biology. He talks about plasmatic bodies mocking zoology. You can tell this thing to be this thing and it'll just transform. And so, yes, it's an aesthetic category because it's about excessive curvature of certain characters. It's historical because it tells us that Disney moved away from that kind of excessive curvature. It is political because there's a political sort of mode of resistance. Plasmaticness relates to a sort of an ability to change shape at will. And that's where the plasmatic body has that basic visual curiosity.
So make sure I've got this straight.
Yeah.
Sergei Eisenstein, committed communist, Marxist filmmaker, making propaganda movies for the Russian Soviet regime, believes that watching Mickey Mouse cartoons will allow you to break free of the capitalist worldview and way of seeing the world.
Yes, and he's not alone. So Walter Benjamin was also fascinated by Mickey Mouse, and in the 30s, he used Mickey Mouse as a reflection of the Hollywood culture industry. And I think the value of Eisenstein's work is not necessarily in its primacy or its sort of playfulness and the way that it was published in the 80s. Eisenstein dies. We find all these notes. It comes together in a book edited by Jay Leder called Eisenstein on Disney. One of the pleasures of Eisenstein's work, or I think the pleasure, is considering the formal issues of Disney at a time when that wasn't really the case. So 70 years ago. So it's yes, he is interested in the power and potency of Disney's animated images, the form in which the ecstasy of transformation is kind of reflected or reflects man's own primitivism. And he says, the famous quote, you tell an octopus to be an elephant and the octopus becomes an elephant.
Okay, so you don't have much time to answer this question.
I've got the fourth category. The fourth dimension is that it's also a technological category because with every encroaching technological development, Disney moved away from that plasmatic sensibility towards hyperrealism. So we have the multiplane camera, but you also have the advent of color and sound, and all of these things Disney used to move away from that plasmatic impetus. So we can also argue that plasmaticness is a technological category because it was dispensed with as a result of technological progress.
In 30 seconds,
oh Lord,
what could you do? Why is this category interesting to think about now in the world of 2022?
I think there's a certain the language of plasmaticness has re-emerged, I think, with in a period that the Michelle Pearson of special effects history would call the Wonder Years, between 1989 and 1995. So a lot of early visual effects discourse, a lot of early visual effects images, digital visual effects are about metamorphosis and transformation. So Vivian Sobchak, writing around metamorphosis, uses a language very similar when she talks about, we know that these things aren't real and are happening before our eyes as a result of magic, and yet we believe and we buy into this transformative metamorphic potential. So there's a sense in which we are now living in a kind of digital plasmatic age where the digital has sort of assaulted the primacy of representation and allows for these changeable kind of liquid metal states.
Where could people go if they wanted to read more about plasmaticness?
They could go to Jay Leder's, the collection of books that go to source. So Eisenstein on Disney. It's I got it for a couple of pounds online, but it's this really intriguing collection of scraps and bits of paper that have been collated together as this really important.
It's like a book of poetry, isn't it?
Yeah,
really
it is. It is. As I said, abridged and incomplete, but really useful. There's also writing by Patrick Power that talks about anthropomorphism in relation to plasmaticness and the kind of bodies that are in flux. And I would probably say, Vivian Sobchak's writing. So she's edited a book called Metamorphing, which is geared towards science fiction, but science fiction is also a genre in which that kind of digital plasmaticness has re-emerged.
Okay, you're a little over time, but I'll let you off because, hey, this is a plasmatic version of the podcast.
Yeah, and time is flexible.
Sure. But we'll call that plasmatic for now. If you have an idea for a future Footnote episode, email us at fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com, and we'd love to take your suggestions. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.
Bye.